Our speaker today is Emeritus Professor of Genetics at the University of Southampton. He's an editor of the Journal of Fish Biology and a panel member of European Food Safety Authority. He's written more than 10 textbooks in genetics and cell biology, and in 2010 he edited the book Silent Summer, The State of Wildlife in Britain and Ireland. He's chair of Southampton's Humanists, and he's a distinguished member of the British Humanist Association. He's also a thoroughly nice man. Would you please give a very warm welcome to Norman Maclean?
Well, thank you for coming to share thoughts about animal rights. I'll try not to do what Alex Salmon did. I don't know if you watched the last debate between Alistair Darling and Alex Salmon on television. I thought it was very badly chaired, and within 5 minutes of the beginning of the debate, Alex Salmon came out from behind his lectern and started indirecting directly to the audience. And as I understand it, that is not allowed. If you have a public debate, the two debaters stay behind their lecterns. Anyway, I'll stay behind my lectern. This much is false. The whole... Is that better? Yeah, that's better. Okay. The whole idea of a right is quite an interesting one. We talk about human rights and civil rights, but what exactly do we mean? Don't you agree it's a sort of entitlement? You're saying, this is something for which I don't have to work or pay, but just by dint of being myself, I am entitled to this. And in a way, the word came to be enshrined in history when Thomas Jefferson helped to write out the Bill of Rights in America in 1790. I think it's quite amusing that there were a whole series of amendments which listed the rights of the citizens. But the second one was the right to bear arms. And the Americans never forget that. They regard it as a basic human right, but they have a gun in their pocket. Anyway, a right is a sort of entitlement, isn't it? It means that just by dint of existence, these things are owed to you. Now, it's to some extent an aspect of society. If you were stranded on a desert island, your human rights wouldn't amount to much, would they? Because there would be nobody else to give you the rights. However, if a boat appeared, you might say, I have a right to be rescued by that boat. So then you would maybe feel you had a human right. So human rights are an important part of our philosophy of life. And indeed, we often judge societies, don't we, by whether they honour what we regard as basic human rights. We say enlightened societies are societies which have a high regard for human rights. Now, I would like to argue to you this afternoon that there's an additional aspect of that enlightened societies not only respect human rights, but also respect animal rights. Curiously enough, the idea that animals have rights is relatively recent. You'll search fairly more or less in vain in the religious texts for references to animal rights. In fact, the biblical view is that the animals are there in a way for our amusement or for our purposes, and that they don't probably have rights of their own. But we've probably all travelled to countries where animal rights are honoured. In fact, countries like India town. To me, part of the pleasure of being in these places is that they regard animals as having rights. Life in the UK is a little bit odd because we have love affairs with particular animals. We have a big hang-up about the horse, don't we? And so horses have major rights, which other lesser animals do not enjoy. But the whole perception of animal rights has only really become part of human philosophy in fairly recent years. And I would certainly argue that it's an important aspect of an enlightened society. But it's not an easy subject, is it? Because animals are so variable. They, earthworms and cockroaches and wood lice and so on, and then snails and slugs and fish and birds and reptiles and mammals. How do you sort out this bewildering array and say, are you going to be decimated with grief if you accidentally put your spade through an earthworm? Is that a big deal? And we're in trouble. In my boyhood, we all had fly papers hanging down from the ceiling to catch the flies. Were we infringing animal rights by catching flies on fly paper? You can guess, and I'm not going to argue that that is the case. Although I do think that you shouldn't willfully destroy other forms of life without good reason. We share the planet with a huge multitude of other species. And in fact, we do not have a good record. We have made a rather horrible mess of managing the planet. And if we had a God-given responsibility for looking after the rest of the animal and plant kingdom, we would have made a terrible job of it. Because huge numbers of them have already become extinct, and many others have a fairly miserable existence. And so, in those terms, animal rights are not accorded very fairly to the animals and plants with which we share the planet. It is a shared planet, and there are all these other species here with us. Even if we're very urbanized and we spend our lives in our houses or in halls or whatever, we must be aware that out there are a huge number of other creatures. There was also a tendency, wasn't there, in the past, for people to minimize the sophistication of intelligence in other animals. It was assumed that other animals they weren't able to think about themselves, they didn't really have an emotional life. It was all about instinct. They just responded to situations. And in recent years, that has very much changed. As well as the flattering remarks made by your chairman, I should maybe say one or two things to assure you that I have some credibility to be talking on this topic. So one of them is that I was for many years the head of the biology department. I was also a trustee of Marlborough Park Zoo, and I used to advise them about how they would look after their animals and things there. So I know about keeping animals in zoos a little bit. I also had a home office license for many years to allow me to experiment on animals. So I'm not really coming at the topic from complete darkness. It is a topic that I've been aware of and been interested in for a long time. In fact, for many years, I used to give our first year students a lecture each year on animal rights. So that's where I come from, as it were. The main thrust, I suppose, of what I'd like to persuade you of this afternoon is that you should accord rights to animals on the basis of what you might call cerebral sophistication. That is the complexity of their nervous systems. And so, if we were to make a graph, the graph might be something like this. And on this axis would be what in the way of rights particular animals have. And on this graph, we would have different groups of animals. So we would have worms somewhere down here. And somewhere up at the top here would be mammals, and particular mammals that, like apes. There are a number of blips on the curve. I mean, down here will be the invertebrates, so we're talking about insects and mollusks and crustaceans and so on. So they will, in terms of cellular sophistication, be fairly low down. And then as we come into the vertebrates, we find fish and birds and reptiles and so on. But it's not a straight line. For example, amongst the invertebrates, there are octopi. And so somewhere down here, we'd have to have a blip. Because the octopus has a very sophisticated nervous system and can learn tricks very quickly and run mazes and so on. So, considering the fact that they're related to slugs and snails, they're remarkably clever. So I think octopuses and squid deserve a good deal more recognition in terms of rights than does a slug or a snail. And there are other blips as we get up here, because some of the animals with which we share the planet, well, let's start with the birds. I mean, birds of the crow family, so magpies and rooks and jackdaws and so on, are comparatively clever, as are the parrots. So, in a way, you have to know a little bit about biology and natural history, I think, to make sense of the rights that might be accorded to different animals. And that especially applies high up here. So we say monkeys would be reasonably higher, apes would be a good deal higher up, and of course there are only half a dozen apes. There are the gorilla, the chimpanzee, the dwarf chimpanzee, the orangutan, and the gibbon. But I would also argue that there's another group in here that you might be surprised to see there, and that is the whales. Now, whales are hard to come to terms with. They live in a very different environment from our own. We may go out whale watching and just get glimpses of them, bleaching or whatever. But let me share a thought with you. If you look at the brain of a chimpanzee, it's rather like a human brain. It's a little bit smaller, but about the same size. But our brain, if I can draw it like this, our main part of our brain is made up of what we call the cerebral hemispheres. And they're very convoluted, which means that the surface of the cerebral hemispheres is very extensive. It's called the cerebral cortex. And the human cerebral cortex, if you dissected it and spread it out, would cover a few meters in size. And there's plenty of evidence that the extent of the cerebral cortex is a good indication of intelligence. Now, if you look at the brain of a chimpanzee, actually it's not very like our brain. The cerebral hemispheres are not very convoluted, and the extent of the cerebral cortex is relatively limited. So although we regard them as our closest ancestors, and genetically speaking they certainly are, their brain is much less sophisticated than ours. The cerebral cortex is much smaller. But we could be in for a shock. If you look at the brain of a whale, even a small whale like a porpoise, you're taken aback. It's remarkably like a human brain. The cerebral hemispheres are highly convoluted. The extent of the cerebral cortex is very great. So probably the animals that we should be most worried about on this list would not necessarily be the apes, but might be the whales. And I think it's with considerable relief I find that Japan has at last agreed that its whaling was not actually for research, and is going to greatly curtail its activities in killing whale on the high seas. Indications of the intelligence of whales are not hard to come by. There are all kinds of astonishing stories about wild dolphins that befriended people just out of the blue and carry people on their backs and so on. And the same holds true today for whales like killer whales, the orca. you know that a lot of zoos have displays, don't they, of killer whales performing and jumping and so on. Now, killer whales are rather dangerous animals to many of the other livestock in the sea. But the astonishing thing is that you can catch an adult killer whale and bring it into an aquarium, maybe twice the size of this room. And within days, the animal is tame. If you try to do that with a lion or a tiger or a chimpanzee, it's a lost cause. The animals we have in zoos are in general the progeny of other animals in zoos. They've been gradually tamed and habituated. But whales have the ability to learn with great speed, and so you can bring them into confined quarters and find that they will relate to you quite quickly. Now, I don't want to get carried away about my case for whales. I do have a love affair with the whales, but anyway, they deserve to be quite high up on this. So it means that when we're thinking about how to deal with livestock, I think we should have a curve like that in our mind. However, it doesn't get over all the difficulties, because, for example, there are some animals that are really considerable pests, like rats and mice. The trouble is, the rat is a very intelligent animal. It's a wonderful mother, the female rat. When I was a laboratory student, when I was a student working in labs, I used to have a white rat, which was a pet. And I would walk around with this white rat on my shoulder, and they made lovely pets. One of the troubles, I don't advise them, because they tend to be very active at night, so they keep you awake when they're scrambling around in there. But then they're an embarrassment, because rats are such a pest to us that we have to trap them fairly ruthlessly. And often we kill them with warfarin, which probably is not a pleasant death, and we kill them in traps and so on. So there are difficulties about animal rights, about saying, how should we go about disposing of animals which are particularly troublesome to us? And I don't pretend that it's otherwise. So having an appropriate attitude to animals is full of difficulties and complexities. Something the same, I think, is true of farm stock, isn't it? We all have, or most of us in this room probably have reservations about intensive farming. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah. Many of us have reservations about intensive farming, where poultry are maybe crowded into tiny cages, or are so thick on the ground that they can hardly turn around, and they tend to peck one another in their frustration. And of course there are situations where pigs are kept in tiny quarters so that they don't lose weight, and even when the female pig is suckling her youngsters, she cannot turn over because she's in such a narrow area. A lot of intensive farming has made people very unhappy, including me. And so I think it is with relief that there are now signs that farming is trying to be more concerned about animal welfare. It varies hugely, doesn't it, from country to country. I mean, it's not difficult to go to southern Spain or Greece or something and see donkeys and mules which are hopelessly misused and are not a happy sight. And so, in a way, the world has a long way to go. That leads on to another comment, because I've used the word happy. I've said they're not a happy sight. I would also argue that there are a number of animals that are not a happy sight, just right into their existence. And they're animals which we have bred. For example, I think it's rather sad that some examples of Old English sheepdogs have got hair right over their eyes, and they really cannot see. And we bred animals like that because we regard them as, we like the look of them, they're cuddly and so on. But I don't think we should introduce dogs that cannot see well. And the same is true of even things like goldfish, where some goldfish have elaborate tails which hang down and are almost useless for propelling the animal around, and they often have very bulbous eyes, which for some reason people quite like. So I do think that we have an obligation to ensure that the animals that we produce by crossbreeding are kind of happy animals. They're animals whose way of life is not jeopardized by the characteristics which they have genetically, and for which, to some extent, we're responsible. Because, of course, the huge variety of dogs are all related. They've all originated from wolves, haven't they? And some of these dogs are so misshapen that they don't really work very well. The same is true of some breeds of sheep. My father-in-law was a farmer, and he kept border Leicester sheep, which are quite large. The trouble is, border Leicester sheep cannot lamb themselves, or can only do it with great difficulty. So poor old Guy was up in the lambing season most of the night, helping these damned animals to lamb, because they couldn't do it themselves. So there are all kinds of problems in animal breeding, which I think we should be aware of, and we should be encouraging farmers to think of the welfare of the animal when he's actually crossing A with B or this or that. So I think there is an aspect of responsibility which we have when we're breeding new kinds of animals. Let me just go and have a peek at my crib sheet and see how I'm getting on. I've got a little note there which says a funny thing. The note on my, it says, beware the bunny huggers. Does that mean anything to you? The bunny huggers. When I was a trustee at Marlborough Park, I was the then director, and the man who created Marlborough Park Zoo, was a man called John Knowles. And John and I had become very good friends, and I had a considerable admiration for him. He started off in breeding poultry, and he then had the idea that he would form a collection of animals. But in his lifetime, he really became very enlightened and was very concerned about animal welfare. And I felt really privileged to work with him because Marlborough Park was responsible for a number of animal reintroductions. And so we bred animals like Skimmerhorn Dorset and Chevalsky's wild horse to be taken back into areas of Africa or Mongolia where they had become very rare. So Marlborough Park was not just cosmetically saying it was concerned about animals, it was actually doing quite a lot about it. But John Knowles had this phrase about bunny huggers, and I gradually came to realize what he was referring to. There are some people who believe they're immensely fond of animals, but what they mean by that is that they like the feel of animals, and they like an animal to be sitting in their lap or greeting them when they come back to their house. It's all about what they get from the animal. It's almost not at all about what the animal gets from them. And I gradually found out in the zoo world that a lot of people who come to zoos are a bit like that. They come and rather gawp at the animals without having any kind of fellow feeling or sympathy or thinking, my God, I'm related to you, you know. So there is that phrase. Try not to be a bunny hugger. Try not simply to exploit animals for the amusement that you get out of it. Now that very phrase, of course, impinges on another difficult issue, because we hunt animals for sport. Indeed, if you go back to Africa, there are still people who shoot elephants and rhinos and so on. That's a difficult issue. It might surprise you to hear me say that I am very mildly in favour, simply because it generates a lot of money. So the American guy who comes and shoots a buffalo or something has to pay a lot of money to do so, and that money gets channeled into conservation of the rest of the animals in the Serengeti or whatever. Although I wish we didn't have to go and shoot the animal, nonetheless the end product is good. So it's a kind of end justifies the means situation. But hunting is more difficult, and it's a very evocative question in the UK, isn't it? I said we have a love affair with the hops, and we have a love affair with horses in hunting. And we rather like to see huntsmen going by with hounds and so on. And there is this next question, is it fair to the fox, or is it fair to the deer that are being pursued? I find that a very cruel question. It's hard to imagine what it's like to be a fox being pursued by a mob of hounds, because a fox is a wild animal and it will pursue rabbits and so on. So there is a kind of correspondence. But I think it's something we should worry about. I think we should be concerned about infringing the rights of animals. And I think that it's arguable that animals should not be hunted. At least they should not be cruelly hunted. They should be given an opportunity to escape, and certainly if they're caught, they should be handled with respect. So hunting is a tricky issue, I think. And that's slightly related to questions about badger culling. Most people like badgers, but farmers have gradually found that areas in which cattle get bovine TB are also commonly occupied by badgers. So badgers are common in these areas, and badgers actually many of them are infected with bovine TB, although they don't suffer from tuberculosis themselves. And so we have badger culls. That's a difficult question. I personally am inclined to think that gassing badgers is a better option than shooting them. But an even better option would be vaccination, but it's exceedingly difficult. There is no current vaccine that seems to be appropriate, and it would be jolly hard to catch all the badgers and all that were known to vaccinate them. But there is a problem, isn't there? What is our attitude to culling badgers? There's another twist to that particular story, because many of us are aware that hedgehogs have become rather scarce, and we used to have hedgehogs in our garden. We don't often see them now, and more's the pity. But do you realize that the major predator of hedgehogs is the badger? Badgers absolutely love hedgehogs, and they have a knack of turning them on their backs and being able to attack them from below, as it were, and then devour them. And so hedgehogs are particularly scarce in areas where badgers are very common. And there is some correlation, probably, between the fact that the badger population has increased so much in the UK in recent years and the hedgehog population has declined. So there's a management issue there about how probably to cull the numbers of badgers just in order to favour the hedgehog. You might say that you have great reservations about killing animals at all, but I think that I would argue as follows. The human impact on the planet is huge. It's very hard to find any part of this earth which is not affected by our activities. Even if you can't hear trains or whatever, almost everywhere is overflown by aeroplanes, and the influence that we have on the life of the planet is huge. But I would argue that comes with another side. That coin has another side. On the other side of that coin is responsibility. That we do have some responsibility for what happens to the wildlife of the planet. I would therefore argue that quite often in confined situations like gardens or nature reserves or whatever, some management is justified. For example, there are far too many deer in this country. Every species of deer is now far too abundant. Roe deer, fallow deer, sika deer, red deer, Chinese water deer, and so on. They've all been allowed to their populations have increased. And I think it is our responsibility to control that, because many other animals suffer from the fact that the deer eat out the browse in woodland, for example, and especially the problem is acute in Scotland, where the population of red deer is far too high. I'm not sure whether that justifies the trophy hunting of stags, but there has to be a way of culling them because much of the highlands and the terrain of the highlands is being destroyed by the abundance of red deer. So I hope you can see what I'm driving at, that our effect on the planet, our huge influence on the world in which we live, brings with it a responsibility. And that responsibility may face us with some hard questions. We may have to do a bit of colour. I'm a member of the RSPB, as probably many of you are. One of the slightly naughty things about the RSPB is that it pretends that it doesn't do any colour. But of course that is nonsense. In areas where there are tern populations, it will cull some of the blanketed gulls or herring gulls, and it will cull foxes and people. So I think that's fine, but I just wish it were a little more open about it. The fact that management requires difficult decisions and sometimes means that you've got to intervene in order to sustain one population which is being overrun by another. So you can see that the whole question of animal rights is not without its difficulties. Another tricky thing is about fish. I suppose fish would come somewhere down here, wouldn't they? So we say they're cerebrally not very sophisticated, their brains are quite small, but they're pretty smart at some things. Their olfactory system, their sense of smell, is very far advanced. And there's plenty of evidence that Atlantic salmon return to the river and leaving a little bit of the river in which they were born, very largely by smell, so they can sense the molecules in the water and return. But what about the rights of fish? Well, fishing is not an activity that we should be very proud of, because a lot of the fish that you and I eat are caught in nets. And the fish swim into the net, and they're gill nets, and then the fish is held by its gills and dies relatively slowly in the net. I wish it were otherwise. I'm very fond of eating fish, and I don't suppose there's an alternative to catching a lot of fish in nets. But I'm just mentioning that there are issues out there about how you fish and whether you treat the fish appropriately. I think that a quick death is preferable to a slow death. So there are questions like that. And of course there are questions with things like frogs and toads that annually make a pilgrimage back in order to spawn in a pond. But if we build a road through the system and they can't get over the road, essentially they've said goodbye to the pond. And that's why in some places there are now little channels being built under the roads so that frogs and toads can find their way back to their ancestral pond. I think maybe the last thing I'll talk about is the question, the difficult question, of the experiments on animals in laboratories, in dissection, as it used to be called. I think I mentioned that I had a home office license for many years to allow me to work with animals. And I used to work with rats and mice and fish and frogs. I think that the activities of the Home Office are something that we should be nationally very proud of. We probably have a more concern and we organise experiments on animals better in the UK than any other country in the world. I mean, I worked in the States for a time, and things were very lax, and nobody was very worried about how you treated the rats. In this country, people are very worried how you treat the rats. In fact, sometimes it seems to be almost out of proportion. I used to work to some extent on fish, and I had the Home Office inspector sitting down with me, helping me to frame a proposal of the work I was going to do, so that I could get Home Office permission to do it. And this involved, a lot of the fish I worked with were tilapia, because they were quite a useful model animal. And as I was writing this out, and he would say, no, I don't like that phrase, you've got to find a different phrase, and are you sure that the fish are being kept in appropriate conditions and you're not keeping them at too high a density? And I was thinking, look at this very moment, there are little boys on the common catching fish and just knocking them in the head when they come out. And yet you're sitting here spending a lot of time about the precise form of words that I'm going to use to carry out experiments on fish. So, in some situations, our home office is almost too much, it's over the top. But nonetheless, I think that's a good thing. We are very concerned in this country about experiments on animals. But that does not stop us from using huge numbers of animals experimentally. The numbers of mice and rats that are used in medical experimentation go into the millions. There are these things we should be aware of. Now, there are people around who argue that all experiments on animals are unacceptable and that we should prove the efficacy of pharmaceutical drugs by testing them on tissue culture. But, you know, it doesn't work. It's not satisfactory. A tissue culture is a culture of one individual kind of cell. So if you test your drug on one kind of cell, it'll tell you what influence the drug has on that cell. But it won't tell you what influence the drug has on your eyes or your liver or your kidney or whatever. Really, you need a whole animal in order to prove to yourself that the drug is safe. And some of you will be old enough to remember the thalidomide disaster. Now that was because we used a drug, or a drug was used, and women who were pregnant were quite often treated with thalidomide. Unfortunately, the drug was not tested on animals. It was tested on birds, and it might have been tested on mice, I can't remember, but it wasn't tested on any higher level. And so nobody knew that the very small fetus in the uterus would be malformed by thalidomide. And so there was a generation of thalidomide children who had foreshortened arms and legs and so on, and were not happy people. So it is like that. It's very important when it comes to testing new drugs to have them tested appropriately. And I would argue quite strongly that you're in cloud cuckoo land if you think that animals can be replaced with tissue culture. It is simply not satisfactory. Fortunately, enlightenment has come to the cosmetics industry, and so cosmetics are no longer treated on rabbits' eyes and horrible things like that. So I think there is a degree of enlightenment, but probably industry has got some way to go. I'm looking at the clock, and I think you've been very forbearing, because most of you are still awake, and I've noticed you making all these adjectives. Anyway, thank you for being good audience, and I hope that some of it was interesting.
Going to go around with the microphone. So the rule is you can't speak unless you've got a microphone, and when you've got it, it will be switched on. Just hold it steadily, and don't do this with it. Okay. So Dean is first.
Yeah, right. That's very interesting. Just a quick question on the grant. I see it's sort of related to recall power and complexity like that, which I get. But isn't it also to do with like suffering, to do with like self-awareness and consciousness, where we can't even see that in our own brains, we don't know where it comes from. So isn't something that a child can be completely irrelevant?
I think that's right. Arguments still go on about the extent to which other species are self-conscious. My own perception of that, and I spend a lot of even my leisure time watching animals, is that we tend to underestimate the sophistication of other animals. And I think many of them are to some extent self-conscious. That is, they're aware of their own existence, and they can think about the way their own behaviour impinges on other species, or certainly others of their own species. But I'm sympathetic, I agree with you. I think that there is a kind of black box here. It's easy to talk about cerebral sophistication, but the truth is, unless you become a mouse or something, you don't actually know what it's like to be a mouse. There have been a lot of arguments about the extent to which animals feel pain. And I think there is little doubt that we've underestimated that, and that many animals, way below the vertebrates, are capable of feeling pain. But I know you didn't like the answer.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I've got 2 questions, if that's okay.
Sorry, I didn't see you there.
Normally with animal rights, you hear people talking about their physical and mental ability to suffer rather than their intelligence. So, when you have animal rights activists, I don't sort of say we should kill tens of billions of animals because they're not going to become big chess players. They say because they're suffering.
Yeah.
Second question is, with pigs, apparently they're just as intelligent, if not more so, than dogs.
Yeah.
So based on that, do you say they should be protected as a result of that, or taken into consideration?
Can I take your second question first? I think that's very difficult. I think pigs are pretty smart, and probably smarter than quite a few of the dogs that we have as pets. Unfortunately, the pig is a farm animal, and we keep them in, but I think that we should keep them in arks and fields rather than intensively manage them. And what was your first question again? I took your second one first.
Animal rights are generally measured by their ability to suffer physically and mentally rather than just
Yeah. And that is true. I mean, watching an animal suffer is not very nice. And I use the derogatory phrase about bunny huggers, but to some extent we're all bunny huggers. We all hate to see animals which are feeling pain. And I think that should cause us distress. And I think we should not tolerate conditions in which animals unnecessarily feel pain. And of course that applies to hunting a bit, doesn't it? About how you kill the animal when you caught it, or whether hunting itself makes the animal feel grief.
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for a great talk. I've got a burning question about regarding snails and slugs. Do you think ethically it makes a difference if you're killing them to make flowers look pretty, or if you're killing them to protect your fruit and vegetables that you grow in the garden that you're going to eat? And if you think we are entitled to destroy garden snails and slugs, does it matter whether they're crushed, hand-picked and killed with pellets?
I think that's all very difficult. I'm a very keen gardener, and I don't tolerate snails and slugs with some of the plants that I grow. And I use slug pellets. I know there's anxiety that some birds or other animals may eat slug pellets. I actually think that the evidence for that is very slim. But I don't suppose it's not great fun for a slug or a snail to die after eating a slug pellet. And I agree with you. But if you're going to garden in this country where we have a rather wet climate, I think you've got to do better with slugs and snails. The alternative, I guess, would be to cycle them and take them into some remote place and set them free. Or your neighbour's garden. But as a Floyd, a lot of snails are smarter than we think, and many of them are capable of homing back to where they were for quite long distances. So they will come back from your neighbour's garden.
Afternoon, Mr. Speaker. One item you haven't talked about, that is, for example, we all up in here love a cat, a pussycat, and our dogs, and birds. Most of all also got budgerigars and canaries. Now, they all need their own territory. That's an item you didn't dwell on yet. And I'm a great believer that a cat, particularly, seems to love its own territory. And I believe that the baboon and the monkeys and all those animals also love their territory by ensuring by spraying. So have you any comment at all about that particular thing, Mr. Speaker?
I think that's a very appropriate question. And in fact, amongst the rights of animals that I mentioned, I should have mentioned the right to have a territory. I think that is a basic right. Animals, as you correctly say, often require a territory. And they'll be very stressed if the territory is too small. Of course, having a cat is a problem of its own. And in one of the books I wrote about wildlife, I said, if you want to have a pet, make it a dog. It's simply because cats are able to kill so many other animals and bring them in as offerings to you. And through our ownership of cats, it means that huge numbers of wild birds are killed. And we have to have that on our conscience. But yeah, you're right about territory. And animals deserve territory.
I'm reminded of the Taoist monk who would have his broom in his hand and sweep his path so that he doesn't kill any ants in front of him. And I'm just wondering, this slope you've got basically starts as almost zero for the worms, it goes up. And as we become more aware of animal rights and pain that might be inflicted upon, I wonder if the slope is going to get much more shallow so that we will accord greater rights to the ant and to the worm than we currently do.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the greatest influence that we've had on the wildlife around us is on insects. And you remember that Rachel Carson in the States, when she wrote Silent Spring, emphasized that the influence of insecticides on the environment was going to be disastrous because so many other animals are dependent on insects. And that has become true in this country also. We've had huge declines in insects. Years ago, I was involved in helping to run a course on what was called river flies. It was funded by the John Lewis organisation, and fishermen and river keepers and so on would come along and take the course, and we would teach them how to recognise the different kinds of flies on the river, caddis flies and mayflies and so on. The course ground to a halt because we couldn't find the river flies anymore. So the pollution of the rivers, even rivers like the Tess and the Itchen, which look wonderfully clean, were polluted with insecticides to such an extent that most of these insects are no longer there. So it's true. We may not brush them
away, fish are caught in nets, etc. But then you said, well, I enjoy eating fish. Some people might say, well, the answer, if you don't like it, is stop eating.
Yes, I'm sure.
Now, I appreciate your stopping eating fish is not really going to change the world too much, but to what extent do you think people should have responsibility in preventing certain aspects of animal cruelty, animal exploitation, by how they live their life?
Yeah, I think the answer has to be yes. I mean, I admit to being a carnivore, so I do enjoy eating meat and eating fish and so on. But the point you make is perfectly valid. And I think that if eating a particular item means that the species is going to decline or become extinct, then I think, no question, we shouldn't be catching them, and least of all should we be eating them. And there's another twist to that. I mean, one of them is the way in which we kill lobsters, isn't it? By dipping them dropping them into boiling water. And I don't really think that's the best way to kill a lobster. I think you stick it in your deep freeze and let it cool down slowly, rather than drop it into boiling water. But that's not the question you asked. But yes, what we eat does have a considerable influence on the welfare of animals. And maybe I don't think deeply enough about my responsibility in that regard.
I think that most people actually care about animal rights. They don't want animals to be tested on because they care about the animals being hurt or being pained as a result. But I think if we truly do care about animal rights, then we have to either stop eating animals because those animals are in pain as a result of dying for our diet, really. So do you think that it's really genuinely possible to care about animal rights as a way to eat the animal? Because those animals are in serious pain whenever they're killed and whenever they're kept in confined spaces. I think at the end of the day, an animal will go through excruciating pain and fear just before they die. And I think we should really consider that.
It's a tough one, and I have to agree with you with my heart, if not with my head, that eating animals does mean that all the animals suffer as a result of their exploitation. The other side of that coin, however, is quite tricky, in that I think there's no doubt that we are a natural omnivore. So our metabolism, to some extent, depends on us eating both plants and animals. And of course the same applies to the chimpanzee, and we've all seen film of chimpanzees eating monkeys and so on. You can be vegetarian, but nutritionally it's hard work. And so the easiest way to have a balanced diet is to be to some extent a carnivore. But I have to agree, your question is very telling.
Sorry, the gentleman just behind there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. You mentioned at the beginning that the Bible doesn't say very much about animal rights. It occurred to me that the story of Noah's Ark was a wonderful story of animal management, and far more animals were rescued than were humans.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I just wish there were more about animal welfare.
Yeah, Paul and then John.
Thank you. Nice lecture, I enjoyed it. I'm a little bit on the margin of we give too much emphasis to animals in some ways. For example, within the last 10 years, on two occasions, these idiots I call them animal rights people let out 6,000 mink from Ringwood, 10 miles up the road. I live on the side of the river. I used to be able to sit there and watch moorhens and coots and ducks. They're wiped out.
Yeah,
it
was a disaster, wasn't it?
Well, the mink got into my duck pen and wiped out 13 a fortnight ago. They stole 3 of them, and they're so ingenious, but they're so vicious.
Yeah.
Now, if I get all remote more lovely little furry mink, I wouldn't shoot them, would I? But the point is that we've got to control it to some degree, and our responsibility of how much we control and what we control is a very difficult decision to make. But I still think that when you say like hunting for sport, well, if you're going to go out and just shoot thousands of deer just because there's a lot of them, you're going to employ contract killers, why not make some money out of it and let people hunt them as well, as long as they're qualified?
Yeah, I agree with that.
But we give so much emphasis to this, which I think is a bit out of balance. But we get worried about people hunting foxes whilst children in India and places are starving to death.
Yeah, sure. It's a complicated world, and I do agree. I think it's hard to get the balance right. I mean, there are a lot of people in animal rights who are pretty crazy, and the release of mink was one of the worst things that happened to our environment, no question. And of course, I mean, I used to find working doing vivisection, the building in which I worked was sometimes invaded by animal rights people and so on. It was like a battleground. And sometimes it requires quite a lot of courage to carry on doing it. One of the difficult issues is the whole question of GM as well. And I have a kind of love-hate relationship with Greenpeace, I must say. I have belonged to Greenpeace, and then I've been disgusted with them, and I've left, and then I've rejoined them. So some of their activities in trying to stop whaling, I very much endorse, but others of their activities I think are pretty crazy. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag.
I've been a committed vegan for 40 years or more, and the first thing I noticed was that my health improved immediately from that. I've never been constipated since or anything like that, and I think but what else it does? It improves. It's good for the environment. You don't have to knock down rainforests and all that sort of thing. You don't have to catch thousands of fish and put them in a net and pile them on top of each other and that sort of thing. But also it makes you more compassionate. You start to think about how you can avoid harming animals, and you become a better person, and you become better treat people at the same time. So I think committing to a veganism is the right way to go.
I think that's maybe right. I just have to say you're a better man than I am.
Well, the other thing about technical research, they're only interested in profits. So they can't tell you something you don't want to, they're not interested. So there should be more research done on prevention, not on prevention, not just.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, a number of important drugs, well, like Emeritus, for example, and a few others, they took generations before they got on the market because there was no profit in them, and so the companies did not want to produce them because they couldn't make any money out of it. So it is very much a profit, an exercise driven by the profit motive.
And it's one more thing about veganism, about animals, eating animals, that I should mention, is that most people, if they have to kill their own animal before they're allowed to eat it, they don't eat it.
Well, that depends on culture. I mean, there was a time in this country when a lot of households kept their own pig, and the killing of the pig was a very important day, and they would all have ham steaks and so on. So I think it varies from culture to culture.
Hi, very interesting. You said that you thought there was a link between sort of intelligence and how many rights the animal should have. And you talked about whales, about how whales are incredibly adaptable. But I was thinking, if an animal is very adaptable, maybe it needs sort of less attention and less rights than an animal that's not as adaptable.
Yeah, that's true. I think there are some species that are, by their ecology, are very fragile and easily become extinct because they cannot adapt. Whales, I suppose some species of whales are adaptable, but a lot of them, I mean, something like the blue whale, which is much our biggest animal, feeds entirely on krill. And krill farming in the southern oceans is now a major industry. And I think that's going to threaten the blue whale. I think that we'll only be able to farm to catch krill commercially for a few years before the populations nosedive. So even something like the blue whale, I think, is quite vulnerable. In fact, I have a sneaking suspicion that Margaret Thatcher was slightly aware of the riches of the southern oceans when she went more over the Falklands, because the fisheries, both for krill and for squid and so on, around the Falkland Islands, are immensely valuable, and I think that might have been in the back of her mind.
Yeah, sorry, just next to the...
Hi, it's not so much a question but a point, because you said you tried to justify the killing of badgers because they're eating hedgehogs, but badgers have always predated on hedgehogs, and you said that roe deer and Chinese water deer are too abundant, and you said that slugs and snails and rats are vermin, but it's the humans that are too abundant and the humans that are the vermin. The animals have always been here, but humans have come along and they worked up the two top apex predators in the UK, and now they're trying to justify culling animals. That doesn't cause the problem, or it's us that caused the problem in the first place.
I'm sorry I didn't say that. You're absolutely right. I think the number one problem with the world's wildlife is there are not too many of us. We've been unable to control our own population. And I agree, that is the number one problem. The population in the UK continues to go up, so we need more roads and more power and more water and whatever. If only we could be more like some other species and regulate our own population, quite a few of these problems would cease to exist.
All of them.
Yeah.
We need to kill ourselves.
I wouldn't be personally too.
Lynn and then the gentleman back.
Thank you, very interesting talk. I have a lot of questions, but the things you've been saying have triggered sort of big thoughts in my mind. I was pleased to hear you talk about octopus and squid, because I watched a programme last year about squid and just how brilliant they are, and how they can be set. I could go around everywhere and no one can have any more calamari in my presence, which is one thing. Secondly, I'm an enormous cat lover, I have two, and my little babies. But of course, I'm appalled by the amount of bird life. I believe that the RSPCA and the application to get together to fund a big program so all cats are given collars with big bells on mine. I've got 3 bells on mine. You can hear them from 200 yards away. They never have to burn because they walk the preset.
Yeah. I agree. You can do a lot to help. Years gone by, my family had a lovely Siamese cat, and Toby had a bell. The other advantage of Siamese is that they have a genetic lesion in their brain. Their visual, the optic nerves in the crossover in the brain are slightly defective, and so their sight is not good, and so they catch far fewer birds. So, in a way, if you've got to have a cat, you might be thinking about Siamese. Yeah, well, I think it's a good charm.
And my third observation also was you talking about vegetarianism. Of course, you say that a field that will feed 20 people if it's got cattle on it will feed 200 people if it's got a crop on it. So when you look at the world as a whole, we really need to move towards vegetarianism.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Dean, can I just ask you, is it not cruel to cats to have a bell going all the time? Doesn't it drive them mad?
Well, they are crazy, yes. I'm sick of them.
It's against the cat's rights.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk, very interesting. You were saying about culling humans. We do a pretty good job of that generally. It's called wars and famines and things like that. But actually what will happen is that nature will deal with us. Something like Ebola will come along and wipe us out. We're very ingenious and we can correct a lot of these natural hazards. But in the end, the earth will rid itself of us.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. I mean, it's not just Ebola. I mean, I think influenza. We had a really virulent epidemic of influenza. It could cull very large numbers of people. My father was in the First World War, and you'll remember at the end of the First World War there was an influenza epidemic that allegedly killed more soldiers than died in the trenches. He developed flu, but actually he survived. But I think a really virulent influenza would probably cull 3/4 of the world's population. I know the World Health Organization are still very concerned. And of course, the Far East is the focal point. It's the juxtaposition of pigs and ducks and humans. And the influenza viruses, which occur in all 3 species, tend to mutate and interact so you can get a mutation maybe in the duck, and then that mutation is carried over into the pig and so on. So the Far East is a hotbed of producing new virulent strains of influenza. So yeah, I think that remains a real problem.
Hi, you talked a lot about when you worked in the vivisection laboratory and you talked about that drugs need to be tested on animals. You didn't actually mention about the many millions of people that have either been killed or injured or made very critically ill through the effects of drugs that have been tested on animals. In particular, I believe it was 2008 in a London hospital where 5 men nearly lost their lives in a drugs trial. That drug was actually tested on a rodent and a primate.
Yeah, but what do you do? Is there an alternative?
There are lots of alternatives which it would take quite a long time to go into.
Yeah.
The Humane Research Trust has a lot of information, the Campaign for Safer Medicine. And
yeah, but I mean, the argument surely zoologically would be to test drugs on our closest relative. But to me, that's not a solution. I don't want to see apes and monkeys used.
But they are. They don't work. They really kill humans, even though that drug.
No, but
been tested on animals.
Surely there isn't a better test than testing a drug on a chimpanzee, is there? Unless you
Well, it obviously didn't work because the men nearly died.
I know, but
Still,
in general it does work. You're talking about the exceptions, and of course there are exceptions. But if we didn't test drugs on animals, you know, we would all die long ago. You do have to have some surveillance.
but there have been a lot of drugs that have been taken off the market because they killed humans.
Oh,
and
sure.
they were tested on animals.
Yeah, I agree. So even testing on animals may not be a complete guarantee. And you may have to, I mean, we still have a curious habit, don't we, of wanting to have drugs tested in Latin America or somewhere where they're first released, rather than in the UK, because somehow it's more legitimate to have people die of an unfortunate drug there than here. But as I understand that, most drug trials do not start off in the UK.
Well, I'm going to disagree with your point of view because I don't think it's necessary. And just to talk about the environment and world famine, we actually import grain from developing countries to feed cattle. Whereas that food could actually go to
I don't pretend that being a carnivore is a good way of using the world's resources. It isn't. It's very wasteful to be eating cattle and sheep because it would be much better if we ate a much higher proportion of vegetable matter in our diet. That's the process.
And I don't think there's a problem with nutrition either for vegetarians or vegans.
Well, I know a little bit about it and I think there is a problem. You can be a healthy vegan or whatever, but you've got to be smart. You've got to
Well, they are smart.
They are smart, yeah, that's probably true.
Thank you.
Should we feed pigeons and foxes?
Pigeons and
Foxes together, if you like.
I think, well, lots of people have a lot of fears of pigeons. And I know that you mean that keeping foxes would be...
Well, not keeping them, but just, you know, roaming ones.
Yes.
So you can't...
Yeah. Well, I've got quite a few sparrowhawks that nest near me, and the female sparrowhawks are pretty fond of wood pigeons, so fortunately they cull some of them, but I've still got part of these pigeons.
I just wondered if you were familiar with the works of Pete Singer, the guy who wrote the original Animal Rights. And I think he would quarrel with your intelligence as a gauge. He would say, as Matthew said, it's whether they can suffer.
Yes, that is exactly what he would say.
Because he also said that if you compare, for instance, the intelligence of some animals to some mentally disabled humans, the animals would be higher up the scale.
Yes.
And yet kill the animals, so should kill the people.
Yeah, that's undoubtedly true. Many animal species are undoubtedly more cerebrally sophisticated than some children whom we allow to survive who suffer birth injury as well. Yeah, there's every possible competition. I don't pretend I've got the answer to the whole story.
Any more?
I like science fiction. And I think a good answer would be, right in the future, these murderers and people that are put in jail all their life, if they did the testing on them, and I think they would think twice about what we were doing if that was what was going to happen to them later on in life. That's all I can say.
It happens in the States to an extent, doesn't it? Some drug trials are carried out on prisoners who volunteer.
That's right, if they volunteer, of course, yes.
Just one thing I thought of. Have you thought of trying to put copper around your plants instead of using the
slug pellets? I haven't used copper.
So what they say is that the kids can rather than electric shock and it won't go.
Yes, yeah, I know that too. Maybe I should.
I'm not sure it's entirely appropriate, but one of the major animal rights that were denied is to die with medical assistance.
Yeah.
I think that's very interesting. It solves a lot of problems as well.
I just wanted to mention other items with friends. We may have been playing on seen the latest advertisement on TV called SPANA, Spanish. Now that is appalled me what I've seen. It's about donkeys and the way they're treated out in the Middle East and India is appalling. Carrying hods of bricks, and it's in alignment actually with what the people in the Simba Donkey Sanctuary are saying, that they should be kept in harmony, in good condition, and loving creatures as they are, and loving them rather than having them to bear weights of concrete and bricks upon their backs. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, you're in agreement with that.
I do agree, yeah.
But it is appalling what I have seen on TV lately.
Yes.
Oh, right, yes, the lady here.
I just wanted to say that I think that a lot of these problems will be solved if somebody over there talked about testing drugs in South America or whatever, and we thought a lot more about our own being kind and decent to ourselves. A lot of the other problems would right themselves.
Two more.
Hi again. What do you know about the dogs home in Manchester that was burnt down, and there were 60 dogs killed?
This believe it was intentional.
Yeah. Do you think they've raised over £1 million now? Do you think that was worth it? The dogs dying to raise the money?
I don't know. Human beings are kind of odd. I mean, if you happen to strike the right chord, people will give a lot of money for a cause, and some other causes are completely neglected. So I would.
Do you think it was worth the animals dying to help the ones in the future? Because you said about you think it's when you go and shoot a water buffalo, and then it helps the ones in the future. But if it was like a group of people and one of them had to be killed, but all the rest have a slightly better life, I don't think it's worth.
It's a difficult issue. I agree. I mean, you probably know. I mean, one of the related questions in Africa is about bushmeat. That many African people kill small antelopes and so on, and even monkeys, and take them to the local market, and other people. I think the only answer to the bushmeat trade is actually to ensure that there are not starving people in Africa. I cannot blame people who are very, very short of food from eating bushmeat. It seems entirely, I would eat anything if I were starving. It's a difficult issue.
Yeah, just to go on track with the donkey issue, I mean, that's basically a ladder technology. I mean, during World War I, we used a vast number of horses for transportation, but ultimately killed or wounded and left dead. And we didn't actually take them out of the country after sort of stuff and that's rot and die. So basically, once you get the technology, they'll stop doing that. Whereas with meat consumption, I mean, tens of millions of animals we kill every year purely to get a slightly better menu. I mean, it's completely unjustifiable compared to using donkeys for construction purposes, which kind of actually pays back. Plus, donkeys are nice.
It's a difficult issue. I mean,
it's all difficult.
Yeah, I mean,
that's journalists don't find it difficult, do they? Somehow. They don't find life difficult.
I mean, diseases like malaria still remain the major killer.
That's natural killing.
Yeah.
Animals get ill too. It's just the way of the world. It's just that we want to keep ourselves.
Yeah, but
it's
hard to see you've got a human being die and say it was natural killing.
No, it's not. It's natural. Yeah. It's natural.
Just following on from that point, you just like testing on animals because you thought, say, a chimpanzee, the closest relative, and it's the best test before we use a drug on a human being. But for if you think chimpanzees have less, less ability to suffer, or if you think they're lower than us in the animal kingdom. But many people think they're just like us, they're earthlings, because we all share the planet together. Now, when you said that, it's reminded me of what the Nazis viewed Jews as, and they thought it was okay to test on them if they were a lower form of life. Do you think that's comparable in any way? And do you think in the future, when people look back on us for what we did, they will see us in a similar light to what the Nazis did to other people?
Yeah, I think it's not unsimilar. And I think that, I suppose, one of the reasons I'm a humanist is that humanists have a view of being human, which takes into account the great weaknesses that human beings suffer from. I mean, I used to be optimistic that we might learn as a species to be less aggressive. But really, the more I've learned about chimpanzee behavior in the wild, the more I think that it's in our genes, that we have inherited aggressivity, and we've somehow got to come to terms with that. Difficult.
I was just going to say, I agree in principle very much with David about we should all just give up drugs and we should all just actually die. And there's such a great debate at the moment about living so long. Yeah. It's just not natural, is it at all? But one thing that I don't think has been mentioned is the fact that we're all animals and we all have an instinct to survive, don't we? And what we're doing is some absolutely dreadful things, but we're doing it really because we're animals, and every animal will literally fight to the death in order to try to survive.
Oh yes, it's what drives life, isn't it?
Yeah.
The desire to survive. Very fun.
Thanks. Got another sort of conundrum. Humans sort of impose their standards and their morals kind of on animals, and sometimes it can go a bit skewed. So, for example, pigs are omnivores. I don't know whether you think it was right for a pig to eat a dead pig, because I've heard that some farmers do that, they'll feed a dead pig to other pigs, and you don't do any harm. I don't know if that's a difficult one.
Well, I mean, as you'll recall, that was one of the main concerns about the spread of so-called mad cow disease, that prions were involved in the dead tissue, and so there are issues in that. But of course, out in the wide world, animals are eating one another, and that's the way they survive. So we do live in a world which is not full of sentimental beauty and so on. It's a wild place. And in a way, the philosophy we have has got to come to terms with
that. Okay, well, we're just on 3:30, so I think we need to stop there. But we've had an opportunity for lots of very good questions, so thank you very much for that. Will you please give another big round of applause to show your appreciation? Okay, so time for tea, and if you'd like to come back after the break, we'll congregate here around about 10 to 4, just to talk about whether we want to do a winter appeal and also arrangements for Darwin Day. And anything else that you would like to discuss, we'll be finished